School Desegregation by Cesar Hernandez. I will be focusing in the Cruz Guzman versus State of Minnesota case. So, going back in the landmark case of 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education, the U.S. Supreme Court set a constitutional obligation for desegregation across the United States. Still today, 60 plus years later, schools across the United States are still segregated, unfortunately, by race. As the U.S. Supreme Court states, separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This is still true in some areas as we look at this current case in Minnesota, Cruz Guzman versus the state of Minnesota. So in November of 2015, when this all started, 7 families and one nonprofit organization started a class action lawsuit in the Hennepin County District against the state of Minnesota. So, on behalf of the children and families of the St. Paul and Minneapolis public schools, their suit states that segregation in the St. Paul and Minneapolis school district has maintained an unfair and substandard educational environment for students of color, alleging a range of constitutional violations, stating that the state government's refusal to change the boundaries of the Minneapolis and St. Paul's school districts, creating charter schools and inequitably distributing those resources, because the Minneapolis and St. Paul school districts or school systems enroll a high number of minority, low income students. The district boundaries violate these areas. So they contend that since many charter schools in the Twin Cities are racially homogenous, they too violate the clause. They contend that the lower academic performance of students in Minneapolis and St. Paul are attributed to, again, that insufficient funding, and requires the state to fund or spend more. So the primary remedy that they're looking at in this case, so the Cruz Guzman versus the state of Minnesota, is a metropolitan-wide busing plan, much like the one in 1974 with Milliken versus Bradley. That one, depending on who you talk to, that one wasn't very successful. But as Dan Schulman, the plaintiff's attorney in Cruz versus Guzman, advocates that this is a solution, because if the entire county area is part of the remedy, then we won't have white flight as we did with the Milliken versus Bradley. Currently, right now, the case is under mediation. It still hasn't been finalized, but I am keeping a close eye on it to see what the final ruling will be with the case. As we continue on how this relates to Washington State. Currently in Washington State, we have about 88% of our teachers that are Caucasian, leaving about 12% of those teachers in our state to be teachers of color, with our student population being 46% students of color and 54% of that being Caucasian students in our state. And as you can see, those numbers do not match. So the first thing that I would like to focus on is our English language learners, again also referred to as our ELLs. So how many English language learners does Washington State have? How many are proficient in English language arts? How many are proficient in math? And the graduation rates for those students. So approximately Washington State is educating about 132,000 English language learners, so that do not speak English as their first language. So moving on to the next slide with some data on that. By looking at the data between our native English speakers and our English language learners, so starting off by looking at our English language arts and the proficiency rates, we have 65% of native English speakers are proficient in English language arts, and for our English language learners, our ELLs, that drops down drastically to 14%. So from 65% for our native English speakers, it goes down to 14% for our English language learners in language arts. Moving on to our math, our native English speakers are around 54% in their proficiency in math, and 15% for our English language learners. So again, a huge difference right there in the proficiency rates in English language arts and in math between our native English speakers and our English language learners. And as we move on to our graduation rates, we have 83% of our native English speakers graduating from high school in Washington State, and we have about 64% of our English language learners only graduating from high school. So about a 20% difference. That is a huge difference, because with that comes unemployment, severe underemployment. There also comes a high risk of incarceration, a high risk of ill health, or a lower life expectancy. Also costing the state money and taxpayers' money, and also not allowing them to be part of the democratic society that we all want to see. So how that relates to me is that I work at a dual school, so it's a dual immersion, and what we mostly see in these classrooms is that 50-50. So about 50% of the students are native English speakers, and the other 50 are English language learners. So as we know, segregation in schools doesn't really happen from district to district or school to school. It's mostly within the school, so from classroom to classroom. So with this, it really helps it narrow it down. It really levels out the playing field for all students in making sure that we give equitable education to all of our students.